You're listening to Back to Us Radio on the Back to Us Network.
Who have I become? 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 Throw tight, midnight, wait up by the lamplight like a housewife. Can't sleep, can't sing, staring at the phone, still it won't ring. Get back, get free, get away from the go.
Good evening, Strong Stance listeners. I am your host, Eli Strong, and we are coming to you this month with another wonderful topic. You know, in the last few years, there's been ever-increasing media attention on the subject of incarceration, particularly in how those institutions affect transgender inmates. From Cece McDonald's imprisonment for defending herself in an assault to Laverne Cox's portrayal of Sophia Brissett in Orange is the New Black to Genesect Gutierrez's White House protest of transgender detainee treatment in ICE custody. Today, we have two guests joining us to discuss the current state of the American prison system, the concept of abolition, and the reforms necessary to protect transgender and gender nonconforming prisoners. Our first guest is Mick Kincaid. Mick Kincaid is a staff attorney and the director of the Prisoner Justice Project at the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. The Sylvia Rivera Law Project is a collective-run legal services and membership-building organization based in New York City, which works to guarantee that all people are free to self-determine gender identity and expression with a focus on TGNCI, people of color, and low-income people. Before working for SRLP, Mick was a staff attorney at Prisoners Legal Services of New York. He graduated from CUNY Law School, where he participated in clinics focusing on the rights of youth in adult prisons and poverty law representation. Mick works in areas of racial and trans justice, LGBTQ youth homelessness, suicide and crisis prevention, and disability justice. Mick identifies as a white trans man and someone living with a non-visible disability. Mick, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. And our next guest is Reese Rathjen. Reese is a transmasculine queer justice seeker. He uses the pronouns he, him, and his, and has been working for the LGBTQ justice. He's been working for LGBTQ justice for 10 years as a political organizer and development professional. Reese has been involved in work to improve the lives of LGBTQ people and their families in 22 states and the District of Columbia. Reese is determined to help resource a grassroots movement for LGBTQ justice and believes great food is critical to building community. Reese, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me, Eli.
Absolutely. I got to agree with you on the great food. That is an absolute critical part of it. So first I want to just thank the two of you very much for joining us. This is a really important issue that I feel like gets some recognition in the community, but not nearly as much as it should. And so before we even start this conversation, because obviously I want us to talk in a lens, as we always do on this show, of how things affect the transgender and gender nonconforming communities. But there will be times tonight where we're going to kind of back up and look at it through just a generic lens of the American prison system. So in order to start us out, I just want to kind of share a couple of statistics that I found while researching some of these subject areas. So some of these are from 2014, 2012. They're just in the last few years. But the United States has 5% of the world's population, but a quarter of the world's prisoners. In 2010, the U.S. spent $80 billion on incarceration. In 2012, 1 in every 108 adults was in prison or jail, and 1 in 28 American children has a parent behind bars. LGBT youth make up only 6% of the general population, but represent 15% of people currently in juvenile detention. And 40% of transgender prisoners are sexually abused, which is 10 times the rate of prisoners in general. Now, that last statistic alone, I saw several different places over different years where that statistic could go from 40 to 47 to as high as something like 53 or higher. That statistic alone is, to me, just astounding in ways that I cannot even kind of enunciate. Like, there's no way that I can kind of really encompass the sheer shock that should be felt when we see those statistics. Now, unfortunately, a lot of times we're not going to feel that shock because as trans and gender nonconforming people, we are used to those statistics being so high. But I think that what's important is that it highlights just the range of injustice when it comes to trans people in the prison system. So, at first, let's start with, Mick, what are some of the things that you do in your work with looking at justice within the prison system, particularly with how it affects trans people?
Sure, absolutely. And you're right that those statistics are, or they should be, horrifying to people every single day.
Right.
But they've become very common and everyday for a lot of people who are working in this movement, and it's important to remember and remind ourselves that those are shocking numbers. And so I have been working within New York State for the past 5 or so years. I have some experience working in California and in Michigan on prison justice issues, but most of my knowledge comes from New York State specifically. So one of the most important things as someone who works on prison justice issues or prisoner justice issues with a focus on transgender, nonconforming, and intersex individuals is to make sure that when we talk about conditions or percentage rates of incarceration, that we're also not in any way dividing people, that we're not saying that TGNCI people are somehow more deserving of fair treatment or somehow feeling incarceration more so than any other particular population. And so it's really important at SRLP that we work in coalition with other movements, so that we work at the intersections of disability justice and feminism and racial justice, and that we're talking about all of these different intersections, and that we see the making central of TGNCI identities as simply a way of making sure that our voices and experiences are understood and acknowledged, not necessarily of prioritizing them. So one of the things that we talk about a lot is something that is true for TGNCI people and is also true for many other identity groups of people. And, of course, TGNCI people often have multiple identity groups that they're a part of. So the overuse of solitary confinement is a huge issue. People are placed in isolated confinement, which in New York State can sometimes mean protective custody, and it can sometimes mean disciplinary solitary. And sometimes if you're in protective custody, you're placed there because the facility has determined that that is the safest place for you to be. And oftentimes people end up in solitary confinement because of behavior that is linked to their gender expression or the way that they, their gender expression. So, for instance, transmasculine people ending up in disciplinary solitary because of refusing to wear more feminine undergarments or having facial hair, and trans women or trans feminine people ending up in solitary confinement because they're wearing their bra or because they refuse to take off their bra for a strip search, or things that are about dignity and identity but are, in the prison context, grounds for going into solitary confinement.
Yeah, I think that whole concept is something that a lot of people are hearing more about, the idea of solitary confinement used as both quote-unquote protection versus punishment, which it's I don't know, I feel like it's super easy to say, oh, we're doing it for your protection, when in reality I think that they've done a lot of studies in how solitary confinement can really affect a person's psyche and affect just their daily lives of living. And if you think about someone who's maybe in solitary confinement spending 23 hours out of a 24-hour day in a, basically alone, how have you seen, or either of you, if you've known of folks or worked with folks that have been in that situation, how have you seen that affect their life, whether it be in prison or after they get out of prison or after maybe they get back put into a general population type of setting?
I mean, it's absolutely devastating, and Reese, I definitely want to give space for you to answer this question too, but it is absolutely devastating, and every single study and either sociological or psychiatric or in terms of medical, physical health has come back with the conclusion that it is absolutely torture. So the idea that someone could be placed in solitary confinement for their own protection is completely inaccurate, and there's no basis for saying that. And a lot of folks a lot of facilities, a lot of prisons are doing this in their mind in order to comply with the Prison Rape Elimination Act. But if you were that concerned, and we all should be that concerned about sexual violence inside prison and outside prison, then the way to stop prison rape is to not put people into prison. It's not to put people into solitary confinement.
Right. Reese, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, or, you know.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Mick had to share.
Yeah. So my question then becomes, if you're using solitary confinement as a protective measure, how much would it solve for protecting someone of trans experience or someone who is intersex if they were put in a gender appropriate prison? Like, because a lot of times when we talk about let's protect the trans inmates by putting them in solitary, not always, but, you know, in the case of a lot of folks that do end up going to prison that are trans, gender nonconforming or intersex, they end up so a trans woman may be serving prison in a male prison. And so we need to protect her from other prisoners, so we're going to do this. And, you know, how much would it solve if we just put people in the appropriate prison for their gender activity?
Well, I think that's a really important question, and I'm sort of having two thoughts on that. And one is that in my experience, the vast majority of harms that people suffer when they are in prison come from staff and correctional officers, and they don't come from other people who are incarcerated.
Right.
And so one of the huge risks that solitary confinement places transgender, nonconforming, intersex people in is that it makes them significantly easier to be gotten to by staff and COs, that they don't actually interact with any other people who they could share their story with or they could report violence to, that every interaction they have with outside people is mitigated through CO contact. And so if that's the same CO that's abusing them, there is absolutely, I mean, yes, people do get their stories out and they fight against that oppression. Absolutely, that happens. But it is a ridiculous situation to put someone in. It is completely inhumane.
Right.
But so putting people in the appropriate housing unit for their gender identity would be a very important thing to do. But I think the violence that occurs in prisons and jails is part of a system of systemic oppression and is not necessarily something that, even something which is apparently so mind-blowing that no correctional facility that I know of can do it, which is to ask people where they would like to be safely housed. Even a big step like that wouldn't mitigate the fact that the majority of COs and staff, civilian staff, see it as part of their job to humiliate and deny basic rights to people who are inside.
Right.
And this is, even if it's not necessarily explicitly stated by anyone, it is enforced in so many different ways. So the people who are incarcerated, for instance, in New York State, the majority of people who are in prison, in addition to being people of color, most of them are from the New York City area, and yet the prisons are, in general, about 5 or more hours away from the New York City area, and so you're very far removed from your home, which makes it very difficult for people to visit you, especially when you also account for things like there's no public transportation to most of the prisons. Most people are living in some form of poverty, and so finding, the option to do the bus rides that go up there, the chartered bus rides often go up to about $50 a person, plus you have a hotel fee, all these other additional issues. It also
and that's not even. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. There's an amazing organization in New York State called the Correctional Association, and one of their directors of the Prisoner Visiting Project, Jack Beck, has this amazing speech he gave last year, and where he talked about this, and that for a lot of the COs who are in the upstate facilities, the only time that they interact with someone of color is in the prison context. And so it also just creates this system that reinforces every